Section 22 of Richelieu by Joseph Gustave Masson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 7. The University of Paris, the Jesuits and the College of France, Philosophy and Erudition, Part 4. The reform introduced by Descartes in the sphere of philosophy cannot be overrated. It is contained in a short work, the Discours de la Méthode, of which it may truly be said that never were there such important and cardinal truths comprised within such little space. The simplicity of the Discours is wonderful. It consists of 6 parts or divisions, the interconnection of which is explained in a preface of 15 lines. The 3 first parts, after having shown the necessity of a new method in the teaching of philosophy, state the rules of that method. Never to receive a thing for certain, unless I have evidently found it to be so. Such is the fundamental precept of Cartesianism, nay, of all science henceforward, and of all philosophy. The next 3 parts show the applications of the Cartesian method both to metaphysics, the keystone to which is the immortal axiom, cogito ergo sum, and to all the sciences, the object of which is the study of man and nature. We cannot, of course, attempt here to investigate the system of Descartes, or to give any detailed idea of the controversies it has suggested. Let us just quote a short paragraph describing very fairly, on the whole, the starting point adopted by the great French thinker, and also the principal defects which characterize it. The discourse of method proposes to find a simple and indecomposable point, or absolute element, which gives to the world and thought their order and systematization. The grandeur of this attempt is perhaps unequalled in the annals of philosophy. The 3 main steps in the argument are the veracity of our thought, when that thought is true to itself; the inevitable uprising of thought from its fragmentary aspects in our habitual consciousness to the infinite and perfect existence which God is; and the ultimate reduction of the material universe to extension and local movement. These are the central dogmas of logic, metaphysics, and physics, from which start the subsequent inquiries of Locke, Leibniz, and Newton. They are also the direct antithesis to the scepticism of Montaigne and Pascal, to the materialism of Gassendi and Hobbes, and to the superstitious anthropomorphism which defaced the awaking sciences of nature. Descartes laid down the lines on which modern philosophy and science were to build. But himself, no trained metaphysician, and unsusceptible to the lessons of history, he gives but fragments of a system, which are held together not by their intrinsic consistency, but by the vigour of his personal conviction transcending the weaknesses and collisions of his several arguments. Cartesianism excited in France an amount both of enthusiasm and of antagonism which has seldom fallen to the lot of any system of philosophy. As soon as it appeared, says M. Cousin, it eclipsed all the attempts made up to that time to create a metaphysical doctrine really capable of supplanting scholasticism. The efforts of Vanini, Campanella, Ramus, Montaigne, remarkable as they were, may be regarded as the outpost skirmishes which precede the general action, or as a kind of guerrilla warfare, to be followed by a more serious engagement. All discussions on metaphysical topics date from the publication of the Discours de la Méthode. Between the date of 1637 and the end of the century, there was not one work treating of philosophy which was not either for or against Descartes. It is only fair to add that the state of society during the administration of Cardinal Richelieu was singularly favourable to serious studies and intellectual pursuits. In the previous chapters we have had to dwell upon the foibles of the French aristocracy and the dangers it created to the government. But we must not suppose that all the gentilshommes were of the same calibre as Bouteville and Deschapelles. We might name many who not only protected literary men, but cultivated literature and science on their own account. Thus the Duc de Luynes, son of the favourite of Louis XIII., was one of Descartes' earliest and warmest patrons. He translated the Meditations into French, and made of his chateau at Dampierre the centre of the first Cartesian academy. The magistracy, too, accustomed as it was to scholarship and to the discussion of abstruse topics, took the keenest interest in literary and scientific discussions. We need only mention Peiresc, councillor at the Parliament of Aix, Fermat and Carcavie, who held the same post at Toulouse. It is hardly necessary to add that the clergy, both secular and regular, were deeply concerned in the destinies of Cartesianism. Philosophy and theology are two sciences intimately connected together, and although the bonds which had united them during the Middle Ages were now beginning to get loose, yet novators, such as the author of the Discours de la Méthode, had to keep on terms of peace, or at the least of armed neutrality, both with the University of Paris and the Congregation of the Index. The Jesuits, perceiving very well the consequences of the new system, brought all their influence to bear against it. The Oratorians took the other side, and even suffered persecution as disciples of Descartes. It is curious to find the Paris salons transformed into arenas where metaphysical questions were freely discussed, and where, what La Fontaine calls a philosophie engageante et hardie, recruited eager and animated champions. Madame de Sévigné herself did not care much about metaphysics, but she became a Cartesian for the sake of her daughter, Madame de Grignon, whom she wished to keep au courant of all that was going on in the fashionable world. Her letters are full of amusing allusions to some of the most salient points of the Cartesian philosophy. Thus in one of them she says, "I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum. I think of you with tenderness, therefore I love you." Descartes, it is well known, deprives objects of their colour, and places these colours in the soul. Madame de Sévigné accordingly says, "Everything being duly considered, your soul must be green." Like La Fontaine, she laughs at the idea by virtue of which the brute creation are nothing but machines, and would not admit that her favourite dog Marfise had no soul. Madame de Sévigné takes us somewhat beyond the reign of Louis XIII, but from what she says, and from what we know also about the Marchioness de Sable, another précieuse of the same epoch, it is quite clear that the Cartesian mania broke out very shortly after the publication of the Discours de la Méthode. In his witty satire entitled Voyage au monde de Descartes, the Jesuit Daniel introduces Aristotle, saying to the French philosopher that the fashion of discussing metaphysics will not last more amongst French ladies than any other caprice, and that there is nothing more common in fashionable rouelles than to hear parallels drawn between M. d'Ypres, Jansenius, and Molina, Aristotle, and Descartes. We shall not attempt to name all the adversaries who stood up to refute the new philosophy, but we must make an exception in favour of Gassendi, who, besides being the most distinguished philosopher of the time, was also the intellectual father, if we may use such an expression, of Lamotte Leveillé, Naudet, Guy Paton, Molière, etc., etc. Gassendi is quite as much an opponent of scholasticism as Descartes. He shares to the full his views on freedom of thought. but there the agreement ceases. In physics, Gassendi stands up for vacuum and for atoms. In metaphysics, he is a decided sensationalist, even to materialism. Having received a copy of the Discours de la Méthode and of the Meditations, with a request to examine them, he did so, and communicated his objections to Descartes himself, who returned them to him together with a reply, where he displayed a lamentable bitterness of temper. Gassendi added a series of instances to his previous critiques, and had them printed in Holland by a friend and fellow philosopher, Sorbière. Descartes answered again in a far worse tone than before. He assumed airs of superiority and of haughtiness utterly unbecoming, especially towards a scholar who was much his senior in point of age, and who, by his character, his modesty, and his sincere piety, deserved to be treated with consideration. He affected to address his letter to his publisher, Clercellier. On several points he maintained a scornful silence. On most others he satisfied himself with giving out affirmations of the most trenchant description, but utterly unsupported by proofs. Hence a period of estrangement between Gassendi and Descartes, who had previously been on terms of friendship with each other. At length Cardinal d'Estrees contrived to bring about a reconciliation. The reader will perceive, in whatever direction he turns his eyes, that French society was endeavouring to establish itself upon an entirely new basis. Richelieu had, whilst adhering to the foreign policy of Henry IV., completely altered the system of government at home. He was a thorough revolutionist, and had applied to the creation of an absolute monarchy the very means which 2 centuries later the friends of Robespierre were destined to use for the purpose of introducing democratic institutions. Reform in the army, reform in the navy, reform in the magistracy, and, as we shall see presently, reform in literature, where there was certainly more need of a renovation than of half measures, which produced no good and seemed to be only a compromise. Medievalism and medieval institutions had done their work, and something new was wanted. Reform was the watch cry, not only in philosophy, but in every branch of human learning, nay, we had almost said of human life. We have already noticed the efforts made by de Bérulle, Saint-Cyran, and others within the bosom of the Gallican Church. The Benedictine scheme has been reserved for this chapter, because although it affected the constitution and discipline of that celebrated community, yet its principal results were connected with the progress of erudition and historical science. The reform of the Benedictine monasteries had begun in 1600 at Saint-Vaughan, in the city of Verdun, which did not at that time belong to France. It had been attended with such success that the French members of the order determined upon following in the same direction, and further of establishing a distinct community totally independent of that of Lorraine. Such was the origin of the famous Congregation de Saint-Maur, the annals of which are also closely associated with the literature of France during the 17th century. Erected by a brief of Pope Gregory XV, it was confirmed in 1627 by a bull of Urbain VIII. The most active agent in the foundation of the French Benedictine Society was Dom Grégoire Taris, a monk equally distinguished by his learning and his piety. He had been appointed by Cardinal Richelieu as one of his spiritual advisers, membre de son conseil de conscience, and he justified in every way the confidence with which the Prime Minister honoured him. Under his direction a powerful impulse was given to theological and patristic studies. Editions of the Fathers were prepared, manuscripts collected together from various quarters, and the library of the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, arranged, completed, and catalogued, soon became one of the finest in the kingdom. Dom Taris it was who conceived the plan and drew out the scheme of the Annales Ordinis Sancti Benedicti, a work which was to immortalize the name of Dom Mabillon. Paris, 1703 to 1739, 6 volumes, folio. Most of the important publications undertaken by the French Benedictines were brought out during the reign of Louis XIV, it is true, but we must not forget that the reform of the order and the earliest attempts made by the monks in the paths of literature were due to Richelieu's initiative, and Dom Luc d'Archery, the first librarian of the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, belongs strictly to the epoch we are considering. Notwithstanding all the drawbacks of weak health and a delicate constitution, he did an amount of editorial and critical work which would amaze modern scholars, and he lived long enough to assist Mabillon in preparing the materials of the Annales we have just named. Students belonging to all countries and all religious denominations have joined in bearing witness to the powerful impulse given by the Congregation de Saint-Maur to solid learning. Their acquaintance with the treasures of antiquity and their sincerity often brought them into trouble with other religious orders, who, less enlightened than themselves, preferred traditional absurdities to the interests of truth. Thus it is well known that Mabillon's rejection of apocryphal saints and of legendary stories was the source of a serious controversy, and that he gave mortal offence by proving that many of the remains exhumed in the catacombs at Rome and venerated as relics of departed saints were probably nothing else but heathen rubbish. He also entered into a dispute with the celebrated Abbé de Rancé, who maintained that monks should be engaged merely upon manual labour. Traité des études monastiques, Paris, 1691, quarto. Finally, we have no hesitation in saying that the creation of the French Benedictine community is one of the most useful acts of Richelieu's administration. End of section 22.